You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Want to shop Walmart Black Friday deals first? Walmart Plus members get early access to our hottest deals. Join now and get 50% off a one-year annual membership. Shop Black Friday deals first with Walmart Plus. See terms at walmartplus.com.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, how to get 30, how to get 20, 20, 20, how to get 20, 20, how to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See detail.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Great War Revisited Episode 10, The Anglo-German Naval Arms Race, Part 10, The Approach of War. This episode will be focused on the events of the last few years before the start of the war in 1914. I think the important thing to remember with this episode is that nobody knew that a war would start in August 1914, and this meant that they were making plans in 1914 for 1915 and beyond. This puts the naval estimates on both sides in an interesting light because it provides some information about what was being planned, but which would never actually happen. The final pre-war estimates for the British were for the 1914 to 1915 fiscal years, and even though they would be quickly derailed, they would still have important ramifications on the Royal Navy when the war started. This episode will also contain a discussion of a variety of different topics, something of a cleanup for sort of random topics that have not yet been covered. This includes the British position and planning for the Mediterranean, the agreements that were made between the British and the French for how they would combine their strength in times of war, the discussions around a possible capital ship building holiday, which had supporters on both sides of the North Sea, and then finally, German planning for a war. They had spent a decade pouring an enormous amount of money into a German navy to prepare for a war with the Royal Navy. And now that the war was looking sort of more likely, we need to look at what all of that money had bought them from a ship perspective and in their strategic position, what options it left open to them, and then sort of what they then plan to do with all their new, fancy, very expensive, shiny ships. We will start today by discussing a topic that has been on the fringes of all of these naval arms race episodes, but we've not really focused on: the Mediterranean. The problem of what to do about the Mediterranean would vex the British government in the years leading up to both world wars. There was no denying that the sea was a critical link in the British imperial chain, providing a highway between Europe, Egypt, India, and the Pacific. But with the increasing size of rival navies, it was becoming more and more challenging to project enough strength into the theater to secure it. There simply were not enough ships to go around, and the continued rise in German naval power made things worse year after year. In 1913, it was learned that the Italians were building 4 new capital ships, and this would mean by the end of 1915, there would be 14 dreadnoughts between the Italian and Austro-Hungarian navies. Both Italy and Austria-Hungary were allied with Germany, and therefore the only assumption that could be made was that if Britain found itself at war with Germany, it would also be at war with Italy and Austria-Hungary. The new construction just made a deteriorating situation even worse because even before they learned about this new Italian construction, the Royal Navy already felt that it was stretched quite thin. In May 1912, Churchill would write to Lord Haldane and say, quote, "We cannot possibly hold the Mediterranean or guarantee any of our interests there until we have obtained a decision in the North Sea. It would be very foolish to lose England in safeguarding Egypt. If we win the big battle in the decisive theater, we can put everything else straight afterwards. If we lose it, there will not be any afterwards." End quote. This was precisely the problem that Tirpitz had been counting on when he first started building the German fleet. The British had obligations all over the world, including in the Mediterranean, but they were now compelled to keep a large home fleet to guard against German aggression. With Germany projecting to have around 25 dreadnoughts in 1913, the Royal Navy felt obliged to keep almost all of its own, 41, in home waters, to provide the home fleet with a comfortable numeric superiority. Given these needs, the Admiralty would tell the government that in an event with war in either Italy or Austria-Hungary, the Navy would not be able to guarantee the safety of British ships in the Mediterranean. It proposed 3 options: work more closely with the French, begin an even larger naval construction program, or do nothing and hope things worked out. This presents a really interesting alternate history, where if Italy had actually honored its alliance with Austria-Hungary and Germany and entered the war on their side, the Mediterranean would have been very different and probably would have been lost to the British. Or even if the Italians maintain a strong neutrality and stay out of it completely, the British would still have serious problems because the Austro-Hungarian Navy would still exist and could still do things. In the event, in the actual 1914, in actual history, the Italians and the Austro-Hungarians kind of canceled each other out in the theater, which was quite lucky for the British and allowed them a lot more freedom of mobility in the Mediterranean Sea during the war. However, the British didn't know before the war that they would have this advantage. And so the problem of the Mediterranean and the anxiety over finding a solution would lead to a meeting between Asquith, Churchill, Kitchener, and various advisors at Malta, which was the base of the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean. Their goal was to determine what the Navy's plan should be in the theater and how it could be balanced against concerns both at home and around the world. After several days of discussions, they came to an agreement that there would only need to be a few battle cruisers permanently stationed in the Mediterranean. This would provide enough strength to make it clear that the British were serious and to respond to any immediate threat, but the battle cruisers would have to be reinforced if there was a conflict with other nations that was a lasting conflict. However, importantly, no permanent decision was made until the Committee of Imperial Defense evaluated the subject. The conclusion of the committee was that, quote, there must always be provided a reasonable margin of superior strength ready and available in home waters. This is the first requirement. Subject to this, we ought to maintain available for Mediterranean purposes and based on a Malta port, a battle fleet equal to a one-power Mediterranean standard, excluding France, end quote. This meant that the Navy would have to maintain a set of battleships in the Mediterranean. The idea of keeping just a fleet large enough to meet Italian or Austro-Hungarian navies, one, but not both of them, was based on the fact that the relations with both countries was still quite good, even if the sort of tension with Germany was growing. And the two nations were actually still more antagonistic towards each other than towards Britain, even if they were technically allies, which was a pretty good read on the situation and is kind of exactly what would happen during the war. And that's part of the reason Italy would kind of break away from its agreements with Austria-Hungary and Germany. Just as important to the situation in the Mediterranean were decisions being made in Paris. Conversations would occur between France and Britain in the years after signing the Entente Cordiale. The French had 6 pre-dreadnought battleships that they kept at Brest as part of the French Atlantic Fleet. These would technically guard the French Atlantic and Channel coasts, but they were completely outclassed by the ships of the German High Seas Fleet. This resulted in the French announcing in September 1912 that those ships would be moved to the Mediterranean. This opened up the French coasts in the north to an attack by the Germans, but it was seen as unavoidable. The French thinking kind of ran like this. They did not have a large enough navy to be strong everywhere. They simply did not have that much money to spend on a navy, given the more important risk from the German army, coming over the border. Because of this, it would be better to be strong somewhere, and strong where their ships could do the most good, which they felt was in the Mediterranean. This was because of the importance placed on the links between metropolitan France and the French imperial possessions in Africa, from which the French military planned to pull manpower in case of a war with Germany. By moving the ships to the Mediterranean, they were just simply trusting the British that they would be able and willing to protect them from the German fleet. This was still a bit of a gamble because the British government was quite adamant that a formal agreement had not and would not be made with the French. They were not signing an alliance. This refusal to admit that any discussions with France represented, quote, an engagement that commits either government to action in a contingency that has not arisen and may never arise, end quote, would continue throughout the pre-war years. During this same period, the British and French naval officials would meet and discuss joint strategy in the case of a conflict in which both were involved. This included strategic discussions about the positioning of ships and also very detailed discussions like the creation of a joint signals book. Both navies saw these talks as very productive, with the Royal Navy hoping that it would make it easier to intervene in a continental conflict both quickly and efficiently. The French Navy was happy to do anything that would tie the Royal Navy closer to France. They do whatever the British wanted if it meant that they would enter a war with France. That's all they wanted. These meetings and the resulting discussions created a kind of charade where the British government continued to insist that there were no actual agreements with France, when in fact very strong informal links and agreements had been created. There were expectations after some of these conversations from the French, and they would play an important role in the decisions of British leaders in 1914. While the conversations between the British and French were occurring, in 1913, it would be an important year for the overall course of the naval arms race, because it would be in 1913 that there were serious discussions about a joint agreement between the British and German governments that would limit the construction of capital ships in the years that followed. On the British side, there had been a hope that the construction tempo that had been displayed in the years between 1906 and 1912 would make the Germans more open to some kind of limitation. When Churchill became First Lord of the Admiralty, he would propose that the British government publicly declare that they would build enough ships to maintain a specific superiority over the Germans. He believed that the Royal Navy should aim for a 60% superiority in numbers, and that the British should publicly declare that they would build 2 capital ships for every additional ship that Germany built over their currently announced plans. According to Churchill, quote, "Nothing, in my opinion, would more surely dishearten Germany than the certain proof that as a result of her present and prospective efforts, she will only be more hopelessly behind." End quote. This plan would be introduced to the British House of Commons, or the idea of this type of plan would be introduced to the British House of Commons. But they really had to think about it a little bit. Now, this type of you do this, I'm going to do that plan, that type of plan, had an obvious upside. It very clearly stated that Tirpitz and the German leaders that no matter how many ships they built, they would always be at a disadvantage. The downside was that the British could test the resolve of the British, adding a large number to their new construction queue to see if the British were serious. They could see that the British made this public declaration, and they said 2-1 no matter what you do, and the Germans just slapped down 5 immediately, the British would have to do 10. There was no kind of ifs, ands, or buts about it. Any other course of action other than laying down 10 capital ships would show that the British were not serious at their threat, and it would make every other threat that they gave less meaningful. Now, in the end, Churchill's idea, this 2-for-1 kind of public declaration, would not become official British public policy, at least until after there were discussions with the Germans, because there was another kind of trend, another kind of feeling within the British government that the answer to this was not threats, the answer to this was not ultimatums, the answers were in diplomatic negotiations around some kind of agreement to lower naval spending. The primary lead in these talks was Foreign Secretary Viscount Haldane, and the discussions between the two governments revolved around 2 different ideas: an officially accepted ratio, or even a more radical building holiday, one of those 2 things. Both of these were a challenge because the British leaders did not feel that they would get a fair deal when the British were negotiating from their position of strength. The idea of a building holiday is an interesting one, and it was actually put forward by Churchill, and the details were simple. Both nations would simply agree to not begin construction on any new ships beyond what was already under construction for a set number of years. It was probably important to say that Churchill does not seem to have believed that this type of agreement was a real possibility, and instead he suggested it and he supported it to kind of gain some domestic political points. This was because such a drastic reduction in naval spending was always going to find supporters among some groups in British and German politics, as there were always those who believed that there was being too much money was being spent on armaments. But Churchill counted on the Germans to veto the plan. The Germans, when presented with the idea, now did not immediately reject it, and instead simply made their agreement conditional on the agreements of France and Russia. And the reason that the Germans made it conditional on both of those nations is because the Germans knew that neither would ever agree to such a plan. For the French, this was due to the fear that it would simply give the Germans more money to spend on their army. For the Russians, well, they were still trying to rebuild their navy after the absolute disaster of the Russo-Japanese War. They were going to keep on building. They had to. They felt they needed to keep on building. With a building holiday unworkable because of the German kind of tying it to these other two nations, the only real possibility was some kind of agreement about force ratios. As with every negotiation that involved some kind of accepted force ratio, it was difficult to find a number that was agreeable to both sides, with the British wanting a higher ratio and the Germans, of course, wanting a lower one. The number that received the most discussion was a 16-10 number, which meant that the British could have 16 capital ships for every 10 that the Germans had. And this number was actually championed by the Germans because Tirpitz and the other German naval leaders believed that such a disadvantage at 16-10 was acceptable to them because it still kind of worked with Tirpitz's risk theory, and it could still kind of allow that risk theory to work because of British worldwide commitments like in the Mediterranean. However, even though Tirpitz and the German Navy settled on this 16-10 capital ship ratio, it was more than what the British wanted them to have. But it was at least something that the Germans were willing to accept. This ratio was publicly announced in February 1913 in statements made by Tirpitz before the Reichstag, which was an important step since before this point the acceptance of an inferior ratio for the fleet was not public German policy. The problem was that the Kaiser began advocating almost immediately for a new amendment to the German naval laws, which Tirpitz was strongly opposed to, partially due to the views of political leaders like Bethmann Hollweg and, in general, the Reichstag, who were at this point kind of done with increasing naval spending, and so Tirpitz wanted to use the ratio as a good way, kind of an excuse to get out of having to expand the Navy even more like the Kaiser wanted. There was also kind of a firm recognition by this point that any German increases in building would just give the British an excuse to increase their own building program. And by this point, the Germans just couldn't go any further, right? This admission that they would accept this kind of ratio was kind of a capitulation on the German part, a firm recognition that their attempts to push the British further than they could go in terms of naval spending had probably failed, and that the Germans had kind of reached their limit first. The announcement of the 16-10 ratio, which was not what the British would have wanted, like they still did not agree to that ratio, even though it had been announced, did not necessarily elicit too much anger from the British. For example, Foreign Minister Grey would say that, quote, "What Tirpitz said does not amount to much, and the reason for his saying it is not the love of our beautiful eyes, but the extra 50 millions required for increasing the German army," end quote. Here you can already see that the British are assuming that the Germans had reached their limit and that they needed to move that spending elsewhere, which is exactly what the Germans wanted to do. The eventual 1913 estimates for the Royal Navy were released about a month later and involved 5 dreadnoughts, 8 cruisers, 16 destroyers, a total of 48 million, sort of just a little bit more than the previous year. And the German numbers were also a very moderate, very small increase. However, a lot of this doesn't necessarily matter because most of these estimates wouldn't actually end up being built because of the war.
This episode is brought to you by United Airlines. When you want to make the most of your vacation, book with United. They're an airline that cares about your travels as much as you do. United is transforming the flying experience with Bluetooth connectivity, screens, power at every seat, and bigger overhead bins to help fit everyone's bag. And with their app, you can skip the bag check line, get live updates, and more. Change the way you fly. Book your next trip today at united.com.
This episode is brought to you by Atlassian. Atlassian makes the team collaboration software that powers enterprise businesses around the world, including over 80% of the Fortune 500. With Atlassian's AI-powered software like Jira, Confluence, and Loom, you'll have more time to do the work that matters. In fact, Atlassian customers experience a 25% reduction in project duration per year. Unleash the potential of your team at Atlassian.com. Atlassian.
After the 1913 estimates were passed through Parliament, resistance to further increases began to grow. As information sort of began to trickle out near the end of November 1913 about what was being planned for the future, a growing number of more radical MPs were pushing for a drastic reduction in what they considered wasteful naval spending. But it should be clear here that what they considered wasteful naval spending would not require sort of a reduction in the naval budget, just a reduction in how much it was going to grow. And in fact, there were some suggesting that 2 dreadnoughts would be a better number to build in 1914 instead of the 6 or 7 that were at the top end of the suggestions that were going around during this period. This sort of wide range of building programs between 2 and 7, which was millions and millions of pounds of difference, and sort of the associated range in the cost, would prompt many discussions between the Admiralty and the Treasury during the period in which the 1914 estimates were being formulated, which was basically the last couple months of 1913. These discussions would end up souring the relationship between Churchill and the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Lloyd George. When Churchill presented the estimates to the cabinet on December 15th, there were $3 million sort of more dollars being spent, mostly on new construction, than the previous year, and the British estimates breached the £50 million mark for the first time. This also meant that the estimates had grown $8 million since Churchill had arrived at the Admiralty just a few years before, a position that he was given to keep cost under control. Churchill, of course, had elaborately detailed information about each piece of the estimate and why it was needed, which would result in lengthy discussions in the cabinet after the estimates had been presented. However, with the growing resistance to further increases in naval spending coming from the Commons, there was much more time spent on discussions of these estimates than in previous years. For 3 days, these discussions would continue in the cabinet, with Churchill attempting to justify his requested increases. He did this by pointing out that due to the ever-increasing German Navy and also the greater number of ships that the Germans were keeping in full commission, the British had to do the same. This meant more sailors at full pay and more ships ready to go at any moment. There was also a technological piece to the increase, which meant that not only were new ships more expensive, but money was also being spent on new technologies like aircraft and wireless systems. None of these arguments were convincing enough for the cabinet to allow the new estimates to pass through and to go to the Commons. The final outcome of the meetings in December was to request that Churchill find a way to reduce them. After the holiday break, the real focus of renewed discussions became the costs of the new construction that was contained within the estimates. The plan was for 4 additional dreadnoughts to be built, and these were much discussed since they represented an area that could be cut and quite easily, which would have both the most drastic effect on total estimates and the least effect on naval readiness in the short term. It didn't affect the crew pay or keeping ships in full commission or the aircraft or the wireless. It just cut some ships from the construction roles. The arguments eventually came down to Churchill on one side and Lloyd George on the other, but Churchill was greatly assisted in his arguments by 2 facts. The first was that he was very prepared, with very detailed information about exactly what money was being spent on what and why, and it allowed him to easily retreat into hard numbers during arguments. The second, and perhaps more important, was that the Navy still had widespread support among the British people, and if push came to shove and Churchill threatened to resign, things would be very problematic for the government, because he could claim that he resigned on the principle of making sure the Navy could defend the country. That was important, right? After the discussions in January, the tables actually turned, and it was Lloyd George's turn to threaten a resignation. This standoff would continue for all of January. It would not be until February that an agreement would finally be reached. The eventual final figure for the 1914 estimates was just a bit under $52 million. Lloyd George was able to extract 3 concessions from Churchill and the Navy. The first was that 3 light cruisers and 12 torpedo boats would be cut from the construction list in the coming year. The second was a pledge from Churchill that there would be a reduction in the following year's estimates, which would actually not have been happening because the war would start. And then the final concession was that the summer maneuvers, which were very costly, were replaced with a test mobilization of the reserves, which was quite a bit cheaper. This test mobilization would be very important to the status of the Navy when the war started. And in fact, this test mobilization would actually end up being an incredibly good decision, and the British were quite happy that they had made this sort of trade earlier in the year. On February 11th, the estimates were agreed to by the cabinet, and then they would be presented to the Commons. These would be the last pre-war estimates, with sort of later wartime planning being done under an entirely different set of constraints, and also a lot of the discussions that were had between the agreements made between Lord George and Churchill and everybody else ended up not mattering because the war intervened. Now that we've covered the state of the British Navy in the summer of 1914, we turn now one more time to the German Navy. When the German naval building program had really kicked into high gear, they were building based on some assumptions about what the Royal Navy would do in a conflict. For example, in 1906, the German Navy believed that when a war started, the British fleet would immediately move into German waters to try and force a battle. This caused decisions to be made about the ships that were built and their capabilities. Here is Admiral Scheer, the future commander of the German High Seas Fleet, discussing some of these decisions. Quote, "The assumption that the English fleet, which had kept ahead of ours in its construction at every stage, would seek battle in the German Bight in the North Sea, or would force its way to wherever it hoped to find the German fleet. On that account, we had attached particular importance to the greatest defensive and offensive powers, and considered we might regard speed and radius of action as secondary matters." End quote. The Germans had to hope that the Royal Navy executed this attack due to the completely unfavorable strategic position which they occupied. They were outnumbered, and due to their position, they had little way of gaining good information about where the British battle fleet was, or where it was moving, or what it was doing. In contrast, the British would always know precisely where the German fleet was at the start of any operation, because the coastline of the German North Sea was very small, and only had a few routes capable of supporting the large German ships. This limited the flexibility of the German Navy and made it easy for the British to know the likely area of operation of the High Seas Fleet if it were to move out into the North Sea. The one hope for the German Navy was that the odds against it could be whittled away at by tactics like the usage of submarines or just the attrition that could be inflicted on the Royal Navy by smaller ships. Unfortunately, the British would do everything in their power to prevent such attrition. The Germans also hoped before the war that they could work away at the British lead-in ships and arrive at such a point where they could achieve at least rough parity in the North Sea. It was then the intention of the Navy to launch an aggressive all-or-nothing fleet battle in the hopes that they could end it victorious, or at the very least in something close to mutual destruction. Unfortunately, even years before the war, the British plan seemed to be trending towards a more distant blockade of Germany, a much safer strategy, with the Germans believing that after 1907, that distant blockade strategy was the likely British plan. The blockade would put the German fleet at a disadvantage, particularly if it was coupled with a more defensive and passive strategy from the British fleet as a whole, because it would force the Germans to be the offensive fleet. They would have to find a way to force the British fleet into a favorable engagement. In 1910 and 1911, multiple war games were run in which the German fleet tried to take an offensive approach against the Royal Navy, with the goal of approaching the British coast and defeating pieces of the Royal Navy in detail. Unfortunately, none of these were successful for the German side because in each case, the British were able to concentrate their battle fleet before the Germans arrived, and then it was kind of just a matter of numbers. These strategic limitations would prove very problematic for the Navy during the war. It would also cause the German Navy to take some, political positions that were a challenge for German political leaders during the war. This was because during the war, there were many discussions about what the German war aims were. Like, what were they trying to accomplish in the war? And these were particularly important whenever possible peace talks were suggested by either side or by the Americans. The frustration of the German Navy at its situation during the war caused the Navy to have some very large demands, such as the retention of the Belgian coastal ports, the acquisition of the Danish Faroe Islands in the North Sea, the addition of various strategically placed sort of African colonies, and several other demands. The reasoning for all of these demands from Tirpitz and the head of the naval staff, Holzendorf, was that they hoped to better their strategic position in the understanding that a future war against the Royal Navy was probably inevitable. The problem with those war aims is that they also made it clear that many of the German assumptions from the earliest days of the naval arms race were completely incorrect. They believed that the British would make mistakes out of rashness, but instead the British had chosen the cautious approach of distant blockade. They believed that they would be able to force an engagement on roughly equal terms, but the inability of the German Navy to determine the position and strength of the enemy fleet always made the German admirals cautious and made that kind of engagement very difficult to find. They believed that the worldwide commitments of the Royal Navy would make it difficult for the Royal Navy to concentrate enough strength in the North Sea, but the decision by Italy to avoid its obligations to Germany and instead join the war against them negated most of the demands of the Royal Navy around the world, especially in the all-important Mediterranean. In many ways, the plan for the German Navy was based on the hope that the British would commit several massive mistakes, which is something that they simply would not do. And so the Navy wanted to use the war as a way to get around some of these problems, but that escalated Germany's war aims and war demands, I guess, to a point where they were probably never going to work. And so it created a conflict between naval leaders and political leaders in Germany during the war. All of that would, of course, only sort of come into play after the war started. And as war approached in the summer of 1914, in retrospect, the decision made by the British cabinet earlier in the year to do a test mobilization of the Royal Navy would prove to be very fortuitous. In October 1913, Churchill had suggested that a test mobilization might be done in the summer of 1914 instead of the usual summer maneuvers, both as a test of the mobilization process and also as a way to kind of save some money. This would eventually be used in the negotiations with Lloyd George. After the estimates were signed, most of the country forgot about the Anglo-German rivalry, and instead the British press had more important stories to cover, like the British Home Rule crisis that was kind of reaching its pre-war height during this time. Then, in the middle of July, the test mobilization began, with orders sent out on the 10th of July and the mobilization starting on the 15th. 8 days later, the Third Fleet, fully mobilized, got orders to begin to disperse, but it would only be several days later that the ships would begin leaving. And even then, only the smaller ships would leave initially. The larger ships kind of stayed around for a little bit longer. Then on the 26th, when news reached London of Serbia's rejection of the Austrian ultimatum, Battenberg, the first Sea Lord, stopped the demobilization, and on the 28th the Navy was placed on a precautionary basis. Admiral Jellicoe would describe the importance of the Navy's quick reaction and the effects of the test mobilization like this. Quote, "We were very fortunate in having the fleet concentrated at the outbreak of the war. People had often pictured war with Germany coming as a bolt from the blue, and even naval officers feared that when the occasion did arise, it would be found, as had previously been the case, the fear of precipitating a conflict might lead the government to delay concentration, with the result that our squadrons would be separated when war was actually declared. Fortunately, the Admiralty in the last days of July 1914 placed us at once in a strong strategic position." End quote. It's almost humorous that after the mountains of money spent by the Royal Navy in the years before the war in preparation for a conflict with Germany, it was a measure designed to save money that would put it in the best possible situation when the war actually started. The history of the two fleets during the war is a subject beyond the scope of these podcast episodes, but it's worth taking a moment to discuss the ultimate fates of two of the primary characters that have been with our story almost since the beginning, Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz and the Admiral of the Fleet, Baron Jackie Fisher. Even though they were two of the leaders most responsible for the navies of their two nations at the start of the war, their participation in the war and their contributions would both be limited. Tirpitz's role at the German Naval Ministry was purely administrative, giving him incredible power during peacetime when it came to shaping the German fleet, but giving him almost no power during wartime to direct or influence the course of the war at sea. Tirpitz would be a vocal advocate for the use of unrestricted submarine warfare during the conflict, even though his lack of support for the U-boat construction before the war would hamper the efforts of the German submarines throughout the First World War. Eventually, after he had threatened multiple times to resign in protest of various decisions, his resignation was accepted in March 1916. He would then devote his time to politics, founding a short-lived German conservative political party before sitting in the Reichstag for the National People's Party during the 1920s. He would die in March 1930 after years of political irrelevance. Fisher would be called back to the Admiralty by Churchill at the start of the war to retake his position as First Sea Lord. Churchill and Fisher had actually gotten along quite well when Churchill had first come to the Admiralty, which was when Fisher was already retired. But when Fisher returned, their relationship was rocky at best. After the failure of the Gallipoli campaign, which both of them sort of disagreed on from the start, Fisher would resign on May 15, 1915. In his resignation letter to Churchill, he would write, quote, "I have come to the regretted conclusion I am unable to remain any longer as your colleague. As you truly said yesterday, I am in the position of continually vetoing your proposals. This is not fair to you, besides being extremely distasteful to me. I'm off to Scotland at once, so as to avoid all questionings." End quote. Fisher would later be placed as the chairman on the Board of Inventions and Research, where a lot of research that would eventually turn into ASDEC would occur, the precursor to modern-day sonar. But the position never really filled his schedule, never necessarily made him super happy. After the war ended, he would best be known for writing letters to the Times in London, criticizing the policies of the Royal Navy, with a particular focus on the amount of ships being maintained that he believed were now obsolete and should be replaced immediately by newer, faster vessels, sort of echoing his opinions from over a decade earlier. In October 1919, he would release the first volume of his autobiography, which I will say is decent, I guess, if not exceptional reading. And then on July 10th, 1920, he would die after a lengthy battle with prostate cancer. The Anglo-German naval arms race is one of those interesting historical events that had a tremendous impact, but not the one that the participants really expected. For the Germans, their quest for a world-class navy amplified the antagonism between their nation and the British Empire. When they hoped that it would intimidate the leaders in London, it really didn't. Tirpitz and those around him believed that in building their navy, Germany would be able to assert itself on the world stage and take its place among the great world-spanning empires, but it was merely a precursor to the destruction of that German empire. On the British side, they saw the race as a political and economic challenge, the likes of which the Royal Navy had not experienced for generations. But in the end, no matter how many ships the Royal Navy had, those ships could not defeat Germany by themselves, and it was only when France and Flanders were littered with the dead that Germany could be defeated. Looking back on it now, while the First World War would have been different had the naval arms race not occurred, in many ways it would have been the same. If the Germans had not decided to build their capital ship fleet, the British would have been able to maintain their distant blockade just like they did during the war. The Germans still would have been able to wage their U-boat commerce raiding campaign. It's very possible that the only real difference is that the Royal Navy would have spent the war with very little to do. But of course, the naval arms race did happen. And without it, the events like the Battle of Jutland also never would have happened. Its legacy would continue past the war years as well. It was the memories of the naval arms race with Germany and the way that it had pushed British naval spending beyond any previous sort of limit that it had that would be in the minds of the British politicians when they attended the Washington Naval Conference. The treaty that was signed, which would put in place the building ratios for all the world's naval powers, and even mandated a building holiday for all capital ships, was an echo of the attempts of 1913 to put a halt to the ruinous spending on both sides of the North Sea. But while the Washington Naval Treaty and the London Treaty a decade later could pause a naval arms race, it could not remove the desire of nations around the world to control the seas. Alfred Mahan's The Influence of Sea Power Upon History had been one of the contributing factors of the Anglo-German naval arms race, and during the interwar years its influence would continue. When the naval treaties expired in 1937, the race would begin anew. However, instead of just two nations separated by the cold waters of the North Sea, the second naval arms race would become global, and it would once again end in war. The Germans would fail in their second attempt at building a world-class navy, just as they had in their first attempt. The British would once again rise to the challenge and begin a building spree in the last years of the 1930s to rival that of the heights of the arms race 30 years before. The ships were different, the threats to the empire were largely the same. The results of that second naval arms race would push naval spending to unheard of new heights, and the fighting at sea would be much more deadly. Just another chapter in the long history of men and nations attempting to gain dominance of the sea.